Edward had always imagined that life would unfold in quiet, predictable rhythm: study, work, maybe love, and eventually, some version of happiness that he could recognize and shape himself. But that vision was violently interrupted the morning he received the letter from his mother. Its edges were sharp, its ink precise, and its tone left no room for argument. He was to return immediately to the family estate. The words family duty and marriage arrangement were carefully hidden between the lines, but the meaning was unmistakable. Edward's heart sank as he realized that the course of his life, which he had been planning with the meticulous care of a clerk, was about to be rewritten by someone else's hand when he arrived at the estate. The air was crisp with the scent of wet earth and autumn leaves. The manor loomed over him like a silent, judgmental guardian of centuries-old tradition. He remembered childhood summers spent here, running through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow him with disapproving scrutiny. Yet nothing had prepared him for the truth of the summons. He was to marry his mother's cousin. Margaret, a woman 30 years his senior, the notion was absurd. Edward was barely 23. Margaret was in her early 50s, a woman whose life experience, accomplishments, and social position seemed to dwarf his own youthful existence. His first reaction was anger, mingled with disbelief. The idea that he could be bound to someone so far removed from his age felt like a punishment of cruel irony. The estate, with its sprawling gardens and silent halls, suddenly seemed like a cage. He had imagined a marriage based on companionship, perhaps even affection. Not a transaction orchestrated to satisfy familial obligation. His mother, a woman of quiet authority, received him in the drawing room. Her hair, once a lustrous chestnut, was streaked with silver, but her posture remained upright and commanding. She explained the arrangement with a calmness that made Edward's blood boil. "Margaret is an intelligent, accomplished woman," she said. "She will provide you with guidance, social standing, and stability. You must understand your responsibility to the family. This marriage is not about your preference. It is about honor." Edward felt the weight of expectation press upon him like a physical force. He tried to protest, to find some argument that could sway her, but she would not yield. The conversation ended with the unspoken understanding that Edward's life was no longer entirely his own. The town, predictably, was abuzz with gossip. Edward's friends in the city had called the idea ridiculous, even humiliating. Neighbors whispered about the absurdity of marrying someone 3 decades older. Yet inside the manor, Edward could not ignore the reality standing before him. Margaret would arrive, and he would have to confront her. Margaret's arrival was nothing like Edward expected. She did not stride into the room with imperious authority, nor did she announce herself with cold formality. Instead, she entered with a measured calm, her eyes holding an almost unsettling warmth and intelligence. She wore a dress of deep green, modest yet elegant, and her hair, carefully styled, showed signs of age but retained a dignity that made Edward's initial resentment falter. She greeted him with a polite nod and a soft, steady voice. "Edward, it's a pleasure to meet you," she said, and in that moment, Edward realized he knew nothing about her humor, her kindness, her wit. The first days of their acquaintance were marked by tension. Edward found her presence overwhelming, her confidence intimidating. Every movement she made, every word she spoke, seemed deliberate and refined, highlighting his own awkwardness and youthful uncertainty. At first, he recoiled, avoiding her gaze, questioning how he could ever coexist with someone so different, yet Margaret was patient. She asked questions not to trap or lecture him, but to understand him. She observed him quietly, offering subtle guidance without condescension. It was in these small gestures, pouring him tea just as he liked it, noticing when he was troubled, suggesting books or ideas, that Edward began to perceive the depth of her character. She was not simply an older woman, a social fixture, or a symbol of duty. She was a person with rich experiences, intelligence, and sensitivity. One rainy afternoon, Edward's walls began to crack. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence inside him. The wind rattled the windows and rain lashed against the panes, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo his own restless thoughts. He paced the drawing room, irritation simmering beneath the surface. Margaret, observing his agitation, suggested they sit by the fire and share a drink, a rare comfort during the storm. Reluctantly, he agreed. That evening, conversation flowed differently. It was not about decorum, estate management, or society gossip. It was about life, fears, regrets, and dreams. Margaret spoke of her youth, of travels across Europe, of ambitions curtailed and fulfilled in ways Edward could hardly imagine. She recounted hardships, subtle triumphs, and quiet moments of joy, revealing a resilience forged over decades. Edward, in turn, confessed his own doubts, the frustration of youth hemmed in by expectations. The yearning for freedom he had believed was his right. In this exchange, a subtle transformation began. Edward started to see Margaret not as a barrier to his autonomy but as a guide, a confidant, a mind and spirit that challenged his own preconceptions. He realized that age, often treated as a limitation, was in fact a repository of wisdom, experience, and nuance he had yet to comprehend. Margaret's perspective, far from stifling him, opened new avenues of thought, new possibilities for understanding the world and himself. Their relationship continued to evolve over weeks. Conversations that had begun with polite formality grew into debates about philosophy, literature, and morality. Edward's initial judgment softened into curiosity, and curiosity slowly transformed into admiration. He noticed the way Margaret treated the servants with respect, how she managed her affairs with grace, how she navigated social expectations without compromising her integrity. Each revelation chipped away at his initial resentment. At night, Edward found himself observing Margaret as she read by the lamplight. The lines of her face softened by a gentle smile, the light catching her hair in a way that made her seem both commanding and tender. He felt a strange combination of awe and comfort, realizing that his earlier fears, ridicule, incompatibility, discomfort were slowly giving way to something he could not yet name. The neighbors continued to gossip, oblivious to the quiet transformation occurring within the walls of the manor. Their judgmental eyes and whispers contrasted sharply with the intimacy growing between Edward and Margaret. The story of the forced marriage became a tale of curiosity and quiet wonder, a drama unfolding not in scandal but in the subtle shifts of human connection. By the end of the first month, Edward no longer dreaded Margaret's presence. He was not in love yet, but he felt respect, trust, and a tentative affection. He was beginning to understand that life, unpredictable as it was, had presented him with an opportunity to learn, grow, and see the world through the lens of someone with far more experience. Margaret, in turn, seemed to appreciate his youthful honesty, his willingness to challenge ideas, and the raw sincerity of his emotions. This first stage of the story lays the foundation for what is to come. It establishes the forced marriage, the societal and familial pressures, and Edward's initial resentment. It introduces Margaret as a fully realized character, not a trope, highlighting her intelligence, empathy, and strength. Most importantly, it sets the stage for the emotional evolution that will follow: the unexpected bond, mutual respect, and the surprising depth of connection that neither Edward nor Margaret could have anticipated. By the close of this outline, the reader is drawn into a world where judgment and expectation collide with the unpredictable nature of human emotion. The narrative promises transformation, growth, and the revelation that love and connection often emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. What began as a forced union slowly begins to reveal the hidden potential for companionship, understanding, and eventually, profound affection. The weeks that followed Edward's reluctant marriage to Margaret passed in a curious rhythm, neither fully comfortable nor entirely hostile. The manor, which once felt suffocating, began to hum with a quiet life of shared routines. Edward's days were still filled with responsibilities he resented, but he found small moments of fascination in observing Margaret navigate her world. She moved with effortless grace, her presence commanding without needing to dominate, her intelligence evident in every decision she made. From managing the estate's accounts to arranging the smallest social gatherings with tact and subtlety, Edward began to notice things he had previously dismissed or ignored. The way Margaret's eyes softened when speaking with the gardeners, the gentle precision with which she folded letters before placing them in her desk, the careful attention she gave to each meal she prepared. There was a rhythm to her life, a poetry in her actions that he had never appreciated in the abstract before. He could not help but feel a mixture of admiration and unease. How was it possible that someone so experienced, so assured, could evoke both his respect and a strange, uncomfortable sense of vulnerability within him? Margaret, for her part, seemed aware of the walls Edward had erected around himself. She did not try to break them down forcefully. Instead, she moved beside him like a quiet river, patient and persistent, revealing glimpses of her world in small, deliberate ways. She invited him to walk in the gardens, to examine the rare books she collected, to join her in conversations with friends and acquaintances. At first, Edward participated reluctantly, awkwardly fumbling through polite exchanges, feeling the stark contrast between his youth and Margaret's seasoned composure. Yet slowly, the awkwardness began to fade. It was during a crisp autumn afternoon that Edward began to feel a subtle shift. They had walked through the gardens, discussing nothing in particular, the conversation meandering between the patterns of the changing leaves and the unusual weather. Margaret paused at a rosebush, kneeling to examine a cluster of blooms, her hands delicate yet capable. Edward watched her, noticing how her focus and care transformed an ordinary act into something almost sacred. Without intending to, he found himself reaching for her hand to steady her as she leaned, startled by her own sudden imbalance. She looked up at him, her gaze calm and untroubled, and smiled, a smile that held no judgment, only warmth and acknowledgment. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but for Edward, it carried a weight that surprised him. He realized he was beginning to care not for a social expectation, not for familial duty, but for the woman before him, who had lived decades longer than he had yet seemed to inhabit the same world as him, with an ease he could not understand. That afternoon, as the wind rustled through the golden leaves, he felt a stirring of affection, quiet and tentative, yet undeniable. As autumn deepened into winter, the dynamics of their household evolved. Edward, who had initially regarded Margaret as a stern, almost untouchable figure, now began to engage with her on matters of intellect, taste, and humor. They debated books and ideas late into the evening, sometimes laughing, sometimes challenging each other, always learning. Margaret found herself intrigued by Edward's fresh perspective, his willingness to question, his moments of raw, unpolished insight that contrasted with her careful experience. She had spent years navigating the world with caution and poise, and yet here was someone young enough to remind her that life could still surprise, delight, and even frustrate in ways she had not anticipated. Their evenings became a ritual. They would sit by the fire, the room filled with the quiet crackle of flames and the occasional rustle of a page being turned. Edward found himself lingering longer than necessary, drawn not just by the warmth of the room but by the presence of Margaret. He noticed the subtle way she tilted her head when she listened, the precise way her fingers traced the spines of her books, the gentle cadence of her speech that made even the simplest stories seem profound. The household staff, initially skeptical of the marriage, began to observe the subtle transformation in Edward as well. He moved with more confidence, spoke with greater patience, and began to approach his duties with a sense of engagement rather than resentment. Margaret, though modest in her influence, seemed to awaken in him a latent maturity. He began to see the value of responsibility, not as a burden, but as a framework within which he could grow, learn, and even thrive. One particularly harsh winter evening, a blizzard raged outside, covering the estate in snow. Edward had been working late in the library, struggling with a sense of purposelessness that sometimes overtook him. Margaret entered, carrying a tray of tea, her presence warm and grounding. She did not offer advice or rebuke. She simply sat beside him, sharing the quiet moment. Words were unnecessary. The silence spoke volumes, the comfort of companionship, the beginnings of trust, the acknowledgement of shared humanity. Edward, who had once bristled at her presence, now found solace in it. As weeks turned into months, Edward's feelings continued to evolve. He discovered a deep respect for Margaret, a fascination with her life and intellect, and a quiet, burgeoning affection that neither he nor she could have predicted at the outset of their marriage. Margaret, in turn, noticed his growth, his willingness to engage, his subtle shifts in demeanor that reflected a deeper understanding of himself and the world. They laughed together, debated, and shared memories real and imagined, forming a tapestry of connection that transcended the initial shock of their age difference. Yet this period was not without its challenges. Society's judgment remained persistent. Letters arrived with subtle derision, neighbors whispered, and friends questioned the arrangement with barely disguised amusement. Edward, however, began to develop a resilience that matched Margaret's own. He learned to navigate criticism with grace, to find humor in gossip, and to prioritize the bond he was building over the opinions of others. Margaret's quiet strength became his anchor, her wisdom his guide, and her unwavering integrity a model for his own moral development. The emotional intimacy that began to form was not rushed or overtly romantic, but it was profound. Edward began to notice Margaret's vulnerabilities, the subtle traces of her past hardships, the quiet moments of doubt she allowed herself in private. He saw her resilience not as impenetrable armor, but as a testament to her humanity. In turn, Margaret observed Edward's sincerity, his growing empathy, and his moments of self-reflection. The initial power imbalance, the young man expected to defer to the older, experienced woman slowly leveled into mutual respect and emotional reciprocity. By the end of this stage, Edward and Margaret had formed a subtle, deep bond that neither of them had anticipated. The initial resentment had transformed into understanding, the awkwardness into companionship, and the social impossibility into a personal reality rich with complexity. Edward, once terrified of a life imposed upon him, began to see the possibilities for growth, affection, and even love. Margaret, who had accepted the marriage as duty, began to feel the unexpected stirrings of emotional fulfillment, drawn to the earnestness, vitality, and sincerity of the man beside her. This outline sets the stage for the next phase of the story, the emergence of mutual dependence, subtle romance, and the external pressures that will test the strength of the bond they have begun to form. It emphasizes emotional development, character depth, and the quiet, powerful ways that shared experience and understanding can transform relationships, even those that began under the weight of obligation. Winter had given way to early spring, and the estate was slowly awakening from its snowbound slumber. Buds began to appear on the trees, the first warm sunlight filtering through pale clouds, and birds returned to fill the gardens with song. Yet, within the grand walls of the manor, a different kind of transformation was occurring, one far more subtle and unsettling than the changing seasons. Edward, who had once dreaded Margaret's presence, now felt an undercurrent of emotion that both surprised and frightened him. It began with small, almost imperceptible sensations. The sound of Margaret's laughter, light and sincere, caused him to pause mid-step, as though he had been caught in a spell. Her thoughtful gaze, once merely reassuring, now stirred a quiet longing he did not fully understand. He found himself noticing the subtle elegance in her movements, the way her fingers lingered over the keys of the piano during her brief lessons, the tilt of her head when she listened attentively, the faint warmth of her hand when brushing dust from a surface. Each small observation sent a ripple of awareness through him, a recognition that his feelings were evolving into something far more complex than respect or friendship. Margaret herself was not immune to these currents. She had lived long enough to know the signs of attachment, and Edward's hesitations and glances did not escape her notice. At first, she dismissed the thought, reminding herself of the societal impossibility. He was young, full of life, and yet married to her out of obligation rather than desire. But she could not deny the subtle shifts Edward's attentiveness, the way he lingered in conversation, the small acts of consideration that went beyond mere politeness. She began to find herself anticipating his presence, noticing the moments when he smiled or laughed in ways that were entirely unselfconscious, and feeling a warmth in her chest that had little to do with duty. One afternoon, the awakening of affection became undeniable. Edward had been wandering the manor's extensive library, a book in hand but mind elsewhere, when Margaret approached. She carried a small basket of freshly baked scones, the scent warm and inviting. She paused by the bookshelf, glancing at him with a mixture of curiosity and something gentler, more intimate. "Edward," she said softly, "you seem miles away. Care to join me?" He looked up, caught off guard by the simplicity of the invitation and the warmth in her tone. The ordinary act of sharing tea became charged with meaning. Sitting across from her, Edward felt a connection he could not articulate. Their hands brushed briefly as she passed the plate, and a sudden unspoken awareness filled the room. The air felt heavier, electric in its intensity, and Edward's mind raced with emotions he had never allowed himself to name. The external pressures of society added layers of tension to their growing closeness. Rumors circulated in town, faint at first but growing louder, suggesting impropriety or scandal. Neighbors whispered about the young man spending extended hours with his older wife, the subtle intimacies that outsiders misinterpreted as flirtation. Friends from Edward's previous life mocked him behind his back, treating the marriage as a joke. Each comment, each glance, created a pressure that made the private moments between Edward and Margaret all the more precious, yet all the more fraught with anxiety. One evening, during a formal dinner attended by local dignitaries, Edward became acutely aware of the contrast between public expectation and private reality. Margaret, seated beside him, exuded poise and elegance, her laughter measured but genuine. Edward found himself captivated by her composure, by the way she commanded attention without demanding it. In that moment he realized that his admiration had deepened into affection and emotion that startled him, for it seemed both impossible and inevitable at once. The recognition hit him like a jolt. He cared for Margaret in ways that went far beyond respect or duty. Margaret sensed the subtle tension between them. She observed Edward's glances, the quickening of his pulse, the way he hesitated before speaking certain words. She had seen young men fall into infatuation before, but this felt different, more genuine, more rooted in understanding than desire. And yet the constraints of propriety, of age, of societal expectation weighed heavily on both of them. They existed in a delicate balance, where a single misstep could ignite scandal or emotional harm. Their private conversations began to carry an undercurrent of unspoken emotion. A passing touch while reaching for a book, a shared glance over the rim of a teacup, a subtle shift in tone or posture, these small signals became loaded with significance. Edward found himself noticing the softness in Margaret's voice when she spoke of her childhood memories, the fleeting vulnerability that appeared when she discussed personal struggles, and the quiet strength she displayed in managing the estate's affairs. Each revelation deepened his attachment, creating a tapestry of intimacy woven from observation, empathy, and growing affection. One rainy afternoon, the tension reached a turning point. The storm outside mirrored the storm within Edward's heart. He had been restless all day, unable to focus, consumed by the awareness of how deeply he had come to care for Margaret. She entered the library, noticing his agitation. Instead of offering advice, she simply sat across from him, their knees nearly touching beneath the heavy oak table. Words were not necessary. The silence between them spoke volumes. Edward's mind raced as he struggled to reconcile his feelings with the societal impossibility of acting on them. He longed to reach for her hand, to confess the emotions that had grown like wildfire within him. Yet the fear of impropriety held him back. Margaret, perceptive as always, understood the unspoken conflict. She allowed the moment to linger, her presence a calm anchor. She did not push, did not speak of love or desire. She simply existed beside him, embodying patience, understanding, and quiet encouragement. Edward, overwhelmed by the intensity of his feelings, finally permitted himself to acknowledge the truth. He loved her not with the reckless passion of youth, but with a deep, consuming affection born of respect, admiration, and shared experience. The realization brought both exhilaration and fear. Exhilaration, because Edward recognized a depth of connection he had never imagined possible. Fear, because the world outside would never understand. because their age difference and the circumstances of their marriage created barriers both social and internal. Yet despite the fear, a new determination began to take root. He resolved to navigate the complexities with care, to honor Margaret, and to explore the burgeoning love between them with sensitivity and thoughtfulness. Margaret, for her part, also confronted her emotions. She had entered the marriage with resignation, prepared to fulfill her duty with grace. Yet she found herself drawn to Edward's sincerity, his curiosity, and his moments of vulnerability. She recognized that her feelings for him, though tempered by experience and societal expectation, had grown into affection, deep and genuine. The realization was both thrilling and daunting. It challenged her assumptions about propriety, about the nature of love, and about the unpredictable ways in which the human heart could respond to connection. This stage of the story highlights the first real romantic tension, the awakening of love and the challenges imposed by societal expectations. The bond between Edward and Margaret evolves from companionship and respect into an emotional intimacy charged with affection, unspoken longing, and moral complexity. The external pressures, the whispers of neighbors, the judgments of friends, the rigid social norms serve to heighten the stakes, making each private interaction more meaningful and fraught with consequence. By the end of this outline, the foundation is set for the next stage, the acknowledgement of love, the first tentative expressions of intimacy, and the moment when both Edward and Margaret must confront their feelings openly, risking scandal, vulnerability, and emotional exposure. The narrative has moved from reluctant coexistence to emotional awakening, setting the stage for the dramatic and deeply human challenges that will define the next phase of their relationship. Spring had arrived in full, painting the manor and its surrounding gardens with shades of green and bursts of wildflowers. The air was thick with the scent of blossoms and the gentle hum of bees. Yet inside the grand walls, the atmosphere carried an electric tension far removed from nature's serenity. Edward and Margaret's relationship had quietly deepened over the past months, evolving from respect and companionship into an emotional intimacy that neither had anticipated. The bond between them was fragile, delicate, and infinitely precious. Yet it demanded courage and honesty to survive. The first gestures of romance were subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Edward they carried immense weight. One morning, he noticed Margaret tending to her favorite rosebush in the garden. The petals were a soft blush, and the sunlight caught the dew like tiny jewels. On impulse, he picked a single bloom and, feeling his heart race with embarrassment and exhilaration, presented it to her. Margaret looked at him, surprised, and then her eyes softened. "For me?" she asked, her voice laced with warmth. Edward nodded, fumbling with the stem in his hands. She accepted it gently, holding it close as if the small gesture conveyed more than words ever could. That moment became a turning point. It was their first acknowledgement, however quiet, that their feelings were shifting beyond friendship and obligation. The gift of a rose was minor in the grand scheme of societal norms, yet for them, it symbolized the courage to recognize and honor the growing affection between them. Edward felt a thrill in seeing Margaret smile, realizing that she was not only aware of his feelings, but, in her own way, receptive to them. Margaret, for her part, felt a rush of warmth and curiosity. She had entered this marriage with resignation, yet she now found herself responding to Edward's gestures with a blend of amusement, tenderness, and admiration. As the days passed, the intimacy between them grew in small, meaningful ways. Edward began to notice her preferences, anticipating her needs without being asked. He would leave notes with thoughtful observations about the estate, suggest books she might enjoy, or prepare meals he knew she would favor. Margaret, in turn, responded with quiet encouragement, acknowledging his efforts with gratitude and gentle praise. Their interactions became a dance of awareness and subtle affection, each move fostering trust and deepening their emotional connection. Yet their blossoming romance was not without obstacles. Society's judgment remained a constant shadow. Letters from distant relatives carried thinly veiled criticism. Neighbors whispered about impropriety and scandal. Even Edward's friends in the city continued to mock the marriage as an absurdity. Each intrusion from the outside world reminded them of the precariousness of their situation. To acknowledge their feelings openly would invite scrutiny and potentially irreparable gossip, yet to deny them was to suppress the very intimacy that had become essential to their lives. The first major trial came during a local social event of spring gathering at the estate hosted for neighboring landowners. The evening was intended as a display of refinement and propriety, yet it became a crucible for Edward and Margaret's evolving relationship. Edward had been feeling the mounting pressure of society's expectations, struggling to reconcile his growing affection for Margaret with the rigid conventions of his world. Margaret, ever perceptive, sensed his inner turmoil and quietly guided him through the evening with patience and poise. During the gathering, a particularly sharp-tongued guest made an offhand comment about the inappropriateness of their union. The words were meant to provoke, to draw attention, yet they had the opposite effect. Edward, usually cautious and deferential in social matters, felt a surge of protective emotion for Margaret. Without fully considering the consequences, he responded with quiet firmness, defending her dignity with a confidence he had not known he possessed. Margaret, though grateful, was also aware of the risks. Such defiance could be seen as scandalous. Yet the incident revealed a new dynamic between them, a willingness to stand together, to support and protect each other regardless of societal expectation. That night, after the guests had departed and the manor returned to its quiet grandeur, Edward and Margaret shared a private moment that would forever alter the trajectory of their relationship. Sitting by the fire, the room illuminated by the flickering glow of the flames, they spoke candidly about their feelings. Edward admitted the depth of his affection, the way her presence had become a source of comfort, inspiration, and joy. Margaret, her eyes reflecting the firelight, confessed that she too had felt a profound connection, a combination of admiration, respect, and affection that she could no longer deny. The acknowledgement of mutual feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying. They were acutely aware of the societal constraints, of the whispering eyes and judgmental tongues that surrounded them. Yet in that moment, the world outside ceased to matter. They shared their first tentative kiss, gentle and respectful, charged with emotion and the understanding of what they risked in embracing their love. It was a moment of vulnerability, courage, and profound intimacy, cementing the emotional bond that had been building over months of shared experience, understanding, and subtle affection. In the weeks that followed, Edward and Margaret navigated their newfound closeness with care. Their relationship was no longer defined solely by duty. It was now infused with tenderness, trust, and a burgeoning sense of partnership. They continued to act with propriety in public, mindful of society's gaze, yet in private, they allowed themselves the freedom to explore the depths of their emotional and romantic connection. The experience strengthened them individually and collectively. Edward grew in confidence, learning to balance his youthful impulsiveness with thoughtful consideration. Margaret discovered a renewed sense of vitality, inspired by Edward's energy, sincerity, and unwavering respect. Together, they forged a partnership that transcended the limitations imposed by age, social expectation, and circumstance, yet the societal pressures remained a looming presence. Rumors persisted, letters of criticism arrived, and casual whispers threatened to unravel the delicate balance they had established. Edward and Margaret understood that their journey would not be without continued challenges. They had taken the first steps in embracing their love, but the path ahead required courage, resilience, and unwavering commitment. This outline captures the first acts of romantic expression, the deepening trust between Edward and Margaret, and the external challenges that test the strength of their bond. It emphasizes the emotional and psychological growth of both characters, the intensity of unspoken affection, and the courage required to acknowledge love in the face of societal scrutiny. By the end of this stage, their relationship is transformed from companionship into a profound emotional partnership, ready to confront the next phase of trials and revelations that will shape the ultimate outcome of their story. Summer had arrived in full force, the estate alive with the brilliance of sunlight. the scent of blooming flowers and the gentle rustle of leaves in the warm breeze. After months of subtle tension, quiet understanding, and the delicate navigation of both societal judgment and personal emotion, Edward and Margaret had reached a turning point. Their relationship, once dictated by duty and expectation, had transformed into a partnership of respect, trust, and love. But the path to this realization had been neither straight nor simple. The initial months following the acknowledgement of their feelings were filled with small acts of courage and affirmation. Edward, now confident in his affection, sought ways to demonstrate it beyond private gestures. He began attending to the estate not merely as a duty imposed upon him, but as an opportunity to share in Margaret's world. He consulted her about decisions, respected her insights, and even took on responsibilities that allowed her time to pursue her charitable work and personal passions. Margaret, observing this evolution, found herself delighted by Edward's growth. The young man she had once viewed with skepticism now displayed a balance of maturity, sensitivity, and energy that enriched their shared life. Their love deepened in private moments, built not on grand declarations but on simple, meaningful connections. They walked through the gardens at dusk, their hands brushing together in fleeting touches that communicated trust and affection. They shared late-night conversations in the library, exchanging ideas, memories, and dreams. They prepared meals together, laughed over minor mishaps in the kitchen, and found comfort in each other's presence during quiet evenings by the fire. Every gesture, every glance, every word contributed to a tapestry of intimacy woven from patience, understanding, and mutual respect, yet society's scrutiny persisted. Rumors lingered, letters carried veiled criticism, and acquaintances continued to question the propriety of their union. Edward and Margaret had learned to navigate these pressures with grace, but there were moments when the weight of expectation threatened to intrude upon their private world. It was during one such moment, a public garden party attended by the local gentry, that they were confronted directly. A particularly prominent neighbor, who had long been skeptical of their marriage, made a pointed comment about the age difference and implied that the marriage was purely transactional. Edward felt a surge of protective emotion for Margaret. In front of the assembled guests, he spoke with calm conviction, defending not only Margaret's dignity but the authenticity of their connection. "Our bond is not defined by age, circumstance, or society's judgment," he declared. "It is defined by understanding, respect, and shared life. That is the truth, and it is one I will honor." Margaret, standing beside him, felt a profound mixture of pride, gratitude, and relief. In that moment, the external world receded, and the unity they had nurtured over months of quiet effort became undeniable from that day forward. Edward and Margaret experienced a subtle shift in how society perceived them. While some continued to whisper, others began to respect the strength and grace of their partnership. Observers could see the authenticity of their bond, the mutual care and consideration evident in even the smallest interactions. The scandal that had seemed inevitable gave way to admiration for a relationship that had been carefully cultivated with patience. Courage and honesty. Their personal life flourished alongside this social acceptance. Edward found joy in Margaret's companionship in ways he had never anticipated. He discovered a richness in shared domesticity, the quiet pleasure of sitting together in the garden, the thrill of engaging in intellectual debates, and the comfort of knowing that he could rely on Margaret's wisdom and support. Margaret, in turn, found herself invigorated by Edward's vitality, curiosity, and unwavering respect. She had entered the marriage with resignation, but now experienced a fulfillment that transcended duty, age, and expectation. Their love was not a sudden blaze, but a slow, enduring flame, strengthened by understanding, trust, and shared experience. One afternoon, as they walked through the orchard, Edward paused to take Margaret's hand in his. The sun filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows on the ground. He looked into her eyes, feeling the full weight of the months behind them, the challenges, the gradual understanding, the blossoming of affection. "Margaret," he said softly, "I never imagined that this marriage, forced upon me by duty, would become the greatest blessing of my life. I love you, in every sense of the word, and I want us to face the future together, unafraid and unashamed. Margaret's eyes glistened with emotion. She had long since accepted her feelings, but hearing Edward speak so openly and sincerely reaffirmed the depth of their bond. "Edward," she replied, her voice steady yet tender, "I have learned that life often gives us unexpected gifts. I never anticipated feeling this way, yet I cannot imagine my world without you in it. I love you as well, deeply and completely." That evening they celebrated their union in the quiet of the manor, a private acknowledgment of their love. There was no grand ceremony, no societal fanfare, only the recognition of a journey that had taken months of courage, patience, and emotional honesty. They shared a long embrace, a kiss that spoke of enduring affection and mutual trust, and the sense that their connection had reached a point of unshakable stability. In the following months, Edward and Margaret continued to build a life that balanced personal fulfillment with societal expectation. They engaged in charitable work together, hosted thoughtful gatherings, and cultivated an environment of warmth and respect in their home. Edward's maturity, shaped by his experiences and his growing love for Margaret, allowed him to take on challenges with confidence and sensitivity. Margaret, buoyed by Edward's support and affection, found new energy for her pursuits and a renewed sense of joy in her daily life. Their story became known in the community, not as a scandal or a tale of absurdity, but as an example of resilience, emotional intelligence, and the transformative power of love. They had faced the initial shock of age difference, societal gossip, and internal uncertainty, and emerged not only unbroken but stronger and more fulfilled. Their marriage, once an obligation, had become a source of profound happiness, partnership, and unexpected joy years later. When asked about the nature of their bond, Edward and Margaret would describe it simply: a relationship built on trust, patience, and the willingness to see beyond convention. Their love had grown from a reluctant arrangement into a partnership that nurtured both their hearts and minds, proving that true connection often emerges in the most unlikely circumstances. The young man forced into a marriage with a woman decades older had discovered a profound truth: love is not constrained by age, expectation, or circumstance. It thrives wherever respect, understanding, and courage allow it to flourish. This final stage completes the narrative arc. It resolves the initial tension, showcases the full development of emotional and romantic intimacy, and demonstrates how the characters overcome societal judgment to achieve a deeply fulfilling and authentic partnership. Edward and Margaret's journey illustrates the transformative power of patience, trust, and the courage to embrace love in all its unexpected forms.